Hi, everybody. Hi, Sergey, David, Nancy, Amy,
Hi.
Cindy. Is it Tagar?
We're on live video. Voice on.
Leslie. Hi, Leslie. Welcome back.
How you doing, Russ? Good to be
Very
back.
good. Getting ready to go biking tonight for
Yes,
335
I'm
miles.
ready for the ride.
All right.
Brett, sorry to interrupt you. Now you are live stream. Please make me a co-host. Thank you.
I will. There you go, James. Thank you. And
You're
I
welcome.
will also hit the record button. Good to see everyone this evening. I think we probably have a lot of new folks, at least new to get set up tonight. I'm hoping we do. Anybody new to get set up here? You can raise your hand. Hey, good. I was hoping we'd have folks. Anybody come from Facebook, CNO Towpath group or Cycling Over 60 group? I put out there to those groups to come join. So it's great to have you here. We have a full class tonight, so we'll give it a couple minutes for people to join, but I am Russ, your host. Nancy, you're new. Great. I'm assuming that's what your raised hand means. And we have James here with us as a TA. He'll be fielding questions in the chat, but I'll give you all that instruction in a few moments. Good. James has put up a few little instructions in the chat. Oh, David, you got someone else with you. Good. I always love when we have two people on the screen. Tell you what, while we're waiting, if folks wouldn't mind putting in the chat where they're from, just your name is there. So just put in there where you're from. I get an idea from where across the globe people are. Hopefully we got some maybe from across the globe. Andy Lehman's from State College, PA. Oh, Nancy's from State College, PA. I've been to State College. As you'll find out, I lived most of my life in Pennsylvania. Western Pennsylvania, to be specific, because Pennsylvania is 2 states. Oh, great. We got all sorts of folks coming here. This is wonderful. Andy and Nancy and Nancy from State College. Oh, good. Linda's from Washington, D.C. That's one end of the CNO towpath. Amy's from Ohio Pile, one of my favorite places. I've been there so many times. I love Ohio Pile. Andy from Potter County. Nancy from New Hampshire. Tager from Charlotte. Franz from Statesboro. David's from Gibsonia. Great. Sergey's from Bethesda. Yutis from Albuquerque. Nancy's from New York. Cindy's from Westminster. And someone named Galaxy, Notebook, Note 8. You're welcome to rename yourself so we can get your name if you'd like, or we can rename you. From Ellicott City, Maryland, unless that's Ellicott City maybe. And Becky's from Amelia Island, Florida. Nancy from Ellicott City. Yep, I thought it was Ellicott City. And Shirley from Dearborn, Michigan. Allison Park, PA. Great. We're getting all these Pittsburgh area folks. That's super. Ann is from there. Chris is from Chicago, visiting Manahawkin, New Jersey. Okay. I didn't know. I didn't know there was a Manahawkin. Giles. Oh, and Mikkel's from Giles, Maryland, or the Greenbelt. Yep, I know where that is too. Super. We got a great group of people here tonight. I'm really glad for this. As you will discover, what we're going to talk about tonight, biking in the Great Allegheny Passage and the CNO Towpath is one of my favorite places. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Glad to have everybody here. Bev and Pete, good to see two people together. I love the couples watching. I hope you get something out of this. Oh, and also Shirley. Yes, Shirley's. I know Shirley. If you've been in classes before, Shirley. Glad to have your husband there with you. Good. Great. Great to see so many people. This evening, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And we'll gather those questions up at the end. I'll leave plenty of time at the finish for questions. Going to take in a little tour of the Great Allegheny Passage and the CNO Towpath from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C. And I think our TA, our great TA, James, has reminded you all, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself when you're not speaking, that way we don't get any accidental background noise. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you here. And I think you're seeing something that says Rails to Trails Adventure, 335 miles from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Hooray, I made it. Okay, good. If anyone's been on there, and I suspect we've got some folks that have ridden it, you'll know that's the Ohiopyle High Bridge, the trestle going across Ohiopyle. We'll get to that in a few minutes. One of the great places along the Great Allegheny Passage. I'm your guide, Russ Eanes. I'm from Harrisonburg, Virginia, which is in the Shenandoah Valley, Western Virginia. I'm about 2 hours maybe south of the C&O towpath in the Potomac River as it cuts along slices through the eastern part of the Allegheny Mountains. I spent over 30 years of my life in Western Pennsylvania, lived in 4 different places. And as I tell you about the GAP, or the GAP Gap, the Great Allegheny Passage, I watched that grow up. I'm a writer, a walker, and a cyclist. I formerly was a book publisher, and when I was a publisher, my favorite thing was to help authors shape their ideas into a book. I'm now a full-time guide with Get Set Up because I love all the energy I get from working with older learners. For those of you that might be new, Get Set Up helps you learn useful skills from people like you so you can do wonderful things. We learn from each other, and ideally we can see you and your cameras are on. You can request a recording after class of this class. You email help@getsetup.io. And if anyone is joining by live stream, and we are live streaming tonight, the best way to participate is to join us and register for a class. That way you can be present and ask a question. Lastly, Get Setup's not paid to promote any specific products. Anything I'm promoting tonight is getting out and riding a bicycle. The Great Allegheny Passage, or GAP, and the C&O towpath stretch 335 miles from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C. It is probably, in my humble opinion, the premier rails to trails riding experience in the United States. 2 different trails that connect in Cumberland, Maryland. And for those that you have been along it, you will recognize this is the Salisbury Viaduct, over 3,000 feet long, an old railroad viaduct on the Western Maryland Railroad. Starting the Saturday of Labor Day weekend in 2020, I spent a week cycling it, starting in Pittsburgh and ending up in Washington, D.C. And again, if you know the route, you'll know that this is the second bridge over the Monongahela River, another old railroad bridge that they've rehabbed and made dedicated to cyclists. I have lived within a few miles, or at most a few hours, of the Great Allegheny Passage since it was first begun in 1986, and I've ridden parts of it more times than I can count. And I've been a guide, a tour guide on the Gap for Road Scholars 3 times. And I've also pedaled the full length. Now, this was the second time I've pedaled from Pittsburgh to Cumberland. I pedaled it the first time, other than leading tours with my 12-year-old son in 2010. I decided to pedal it in September 2020 as sort of a safe way to take a trip. I used to live in Farmington, which is about 6 miles from Ohiopyle. So for the person who joined us tonight from Ohiopyle, I know the area well. I first walked part of it right after the section opened from Ohiopyle to Confluence in 1986, a 10-mile, maybe 11-mile stretch that was really how the whole Great Allegheny Passage began. That's where the dream began. This is a map of it to give you an idea. Starting in Pittsburgh, the Great Allegheny Passage winds its way southeasterly until it reaches Cumberland, Maryland. That's 150 miles. There, it picks up the C&O, or Chesapeake and Ohio towpath. Is an old canal that ran right alongside the Potomac River all the way into Washington, D.C. 2 very different paths, because the Gap, or Great Allegheny Passage, is a rails to trails, meaning that it is the path is on top of an old railroad bed. So it means it's well drained, very firm, very hard. It's crushed limestone, my favorite surface actually to pedal on. Whereas the C&O towpath runs along is dirt and gravel and rocks and roots, going alongside the river. And it's a fabulous experience to bike, but slightly different experience to bike. And one reason that it's a bit rougher is the same reason that the C&O Canal failed originally, which is that it gets flooded by the Potomac River. Just to give you an idea of the elevation changes from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C., this looks much more dramatic than it is. I always tell people this route is flat. That doesn't mean there isn't a gain or loss in elevation, but you don't climb any hills, and that's the best part of it. 335 miles and no hills. So if you don't like hills, this is for you. Pittsburgh is 720 feet above sea level. Washington, D.C. is sea level. Cumberland, Maryland, where the two routes meet, is 605 feet above sea level. So when you're piking the direction that I went from Pittsburgh to Washington, you head east, southeast, and you eventually gain an elevation until you reach the Eastern Continental Divide, which is almost 2,400 feet above sea level. And then you have the most delightful 20-mile. You can't coast it, but you can just about coast. It's a very easy pedal from there all the way down into Cumberland. And then from there, it's almost completely level all the way to Washington because they had to keep the canal level in between. So the only thing that changes in elevation is the locks, and there's 74 locks, and they drop about 8 feet. And they're located every few miles. Otherwise, the C&O towpath is also flat. If you're riding the other direction, you don't really notice it when you're going from Washington to Cumberland that you're gaining any elevation. And then there is a 1.5%, I think it's a 1.5% climb up to the Eastern Continental Divide. Looks daunting. Is not as hard as you might think. My 12-year-old son did it in 2010. There are numerous trailheads that you can get onto the Great Allegheny Passage or the C&O towpath. The western terminus, where it ends, is at the Point in Pittsburgh. That's where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet to form the Ohio. So coming from the north, draining all the way, starting in western New York State, is the Allegheny River. And coming up from West Virginia in the south is the Monongahela. This little point, this is literally the Point, and that's what they call it in Pittsburgh, the Point, and there's a huge fountain there. There's also the outlines of an old fort because in 1750, this was a hotly contested spot known as the Forks of the Ohio. And this is where what's called the French and Indian War began because the British wanted to come and oust the French from their fort here. And none other than George Washington led a force which actually started the war. Some people say the American Revolution actually began in the French and Indian War. However way you want to look at it, it's a momentous place going back to the 1750s. Eventually, the British captured it, built a fort, Fort Pitt, Pittsburgh. That's where the name comes from. Backing up a little bit from that spot on the Point, you can again see the Monongahela and the Allegheny rivers coming in and the beautiful city of Pittsburgh. And I have to say that someone who's a former Pittsburgher, that the view of the city from the heights, this is Mount Washington to the south of the city, is one of the most spectacular views. And I got to say, this is a dramatic place to start your ride. I love starting the ride at the Point. I rode, for those that want to know gear, I rode my Specialized Sequoia, which is sort of an adventure / gravel bike, which can handle all kinds of terrains. I carried two 20-liter panniers on the back, loaded with about 35 pounds of gear, which was too much. And I also had a handlebar bag in front. My handlebar bag has a little clear plastic map case right there. So I'll show you later, I've got the map and guidebook. So I could keep track of where I was going with my map. I really like that. Couple water bottles. My tires are, for those that want to know, are 42 millimeter tubeless tires, and I've got hydraulic disc brakes. Hardly needed my brakes on this ride though. If anything, I had a problem with the bike falling over when I stopped too often. There's my gear. Some people want to know what I packed. I've got a gear list for you at the end. So there's always an email that comes to you after this class with a few notes to follow up. I'll have some links for you, and I've got a list of my gear. So if you want to know what I brought, there's a list of all the stuff here, everything I have from jerseys to bike tools. I highly recommend if you ride it, you pick up a copy of the trail guide. They bring out a new one about every year. And this is the one from last year. In the trail guide is a fabulous map. On one side is the Great Allegheny Passage. Flip it over. The other side is a C&O towpath. And it gives you all the major points along here, shows highlights, towns, places where there are trailheads and rest stops if you need a bathroom or some water. Great little map. It's waterproof, which I like. The Great Allegheny Passage follows the old Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad and the Western Maryland Railroad for 150 miles to Cumberland, Maryland. It's paved with crushed limestone and it's well drained. So the old Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad started in Pittsburgh and went to Connellsville, Pennsylvania, where there was a junction with the Western Maryland Railroad, which actually began all the way out in Baltimore, was abandoned was sold in the 1960s to what was then called, I think the C&O or the Chessie system, which was succeeded the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And the C&O abandoned it in 1970s. And abandoning a railroad is not as easy as you think. If you live, for example, a lot of states require that all the bridges be removed and the tunnels be closed up. So rather than do all that, they sold the right of way to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, who then dreamed of this idea of a rail trail all the way from Pittsburgh to Cumberland. I'm very thankful today for those who had the vision to do it. I started out at the point with some of my family members joining me. It was a delightful Labor Day weekend. I would say perfect biking weather. It was in the 70s, and I had 2 grandsons and a son and a daughter and a son-in-law all join me at the point. Behind them and me is the Ohio River. So we're at the point that's behind us is going west, and up here on the point, this is where I had taken the picture of Pittsburgh from before. This is where the Duquesne incline goes up and down. The first 15 miles out of Pittsburgh are paved asphalt, so it isn't all crushed limestone. This is the Hot Metal Bridge, and you start your ride on the north bank of the Monongahela, and after about 5 or 6 miles, you cross over and take the Hot Metal Bridge to the south bank of the Monongahela, which winds around to McKeesport. The gap itself has 4 tunnels and numerous bridges. The longest tunnel is 3,300 feet, and it's lit with lights. This is not it. This is the Pinkerton Tunnel, which was the last tunnel they opened up about 2015. I'm really glad they opened this up. Before, there was a little detour you had to take around the river. This is the biggest tunnel. This is the Big Savage Tunnel, which is, by the way, not open year-round. It is closed from like early November until early April. It just opened about a month ago. It's over 3,300 feet long. It has lights inside. I once led a tour group, and some of the people got ahead of the group, and they went into the tunnel, and the lights were out. And if you want to know the definition of pitch black, stand in the middle of that tunnel with no lights on. You cannot see the hand in front of your face. Fortunately, they got out some cell phones, and they were able to illuminate and ride their way, or walk their way, I shouldn't say ride, the rest of the way through the tunnel. All along the Great Allegheny Passage are historical markers, and they give you a great idea of the history, especially the industrialized history of Western Pennsylvania. And I recommend anyone who rides it stop and look at some of those historical markers. One of the big ones you hit early on is you come into Homestead, and the Battle of Homestead was not from a war. It was a labor battle when there was a strike of the Andrew Carnegie Steel Works in 1892. I won't go into all that history, but it's memorialized here. Steel, coal, and coke are the big history of riding the Great Allegheny Passage, because the Monongahela, the Youghiogheny rivers, and the Castleman rivers that the route follows are all the center of the coal mining. And then what they do, with the coal, they make it into something called coke, which is pure carbon, and they put that in the blast furnaces. There are other historical mines. You go along there. There's one for the Dar mine disaster. There's a very quiet little spot back in the woods. You wouldn't have a clue that it's a place where 239 men died in a mine disaster. All along the Youghiogheny River, as you're following it all the way through Ohiopyle to Confluence, was coal mining, and there were big tipples and all sorts of things like well, here's an example of an old beehive coke oven back up in the woods. The woods have completely overgrown it. They're very hard to find. You have to know where you're looking these days to be able to find the old beehive coke ovens. But the valley around Connellsville had 50,000 coke ovens 100 years ago. My favorite part is riding through the Ohiopyle State Park, and that starts just outside of Connellsville. The path through there is delightful. It's very shady, and many times you can stop and overlook the Youghiogheny River, which is very wild. The Youghiogheny River starts slicing through the Allegheny Mountains and forms the Youghiogheny Gorge, and it goes into the town of Ohiopyle. When you're cycling through that state park, you get a lesson in geology. There's many places where the rock strata is cut through, and there's a great place where there's a marker you can stop and read about the geology, and there's a chunk of coal you can pick up like this. You find this all along there where the strata has been opened up, the old rock seams. The most dramatic bridges along the route are in Ohiopyle and Myersdale, and this is the high bridge in Ohiopyle. It is about 100 feet above the water. It was a railroad trestle for the Western Maryland Railway. And when you come into Ohiopyle, you come across a trestle like this. It is very dramatic, and there are white water rafters below you, but I had to get off the trail and go all the way down to get this picture, because that is a dramatic view of the Ohiopyle High Bridge, and it's just something else to see. You can see there's a few rafters here in the middle of the river. Everybody stops to get a picture there. The day I was there, Labor Day, the river was full of rafters. I believe that Ohiopyle is probably, and we've got a person here from Ohiopyle can correct me, but I think it is the #1 whitewater rafting spot in the eastern United States. When you're in Ohiopyle, you do need to take a short detour and go visit the falls. I've been there many, many times. I will confess the last time I was through there in September, the town was really crowded, and I didn't take a detour to see the falls. I'd seen them a lot, but they're beautiful. There's also a new bridge over the Youghiogheny River. This is the river over here on the right, on the other side of what's called Ferncliff Peninsula. The Youghiogheny River makes a big loop, and it drops. That's where it drops almost 100 feet in elevation around that 3/4 to 1 mile loop, and in the middle is Ferncliff Peninsula. And when I first moved to the area in 1986, this bridge, back up, that bridge wasn't in existence. It's been rebuilt recently. Is also a beautiful bridge, one of many, many along the gap. Along the way, the Great Allegheny Passage gains gradually in elevation until it reaches the Eastern Continental Divide, about 23 miles from Cumberland. And from there, it's a 1.5% downhill grade until you reach Cumberland. This is the Eastern Continental Divide. There's a little road overpass there. So the C&O towpath runs from Cumberland to Washington, and it has an elevation drop of about 600 feet, but you only know it when you reach a lock. Otherwise, it's completely flat. Now, this is where the towpath begins, heading just outside of Cumberland. And if you look in the picture, you can see this big V, this big notch cut in the mountains. And that's where the Great Allegheny Passage comes from. So it comes down out of the Allegheny Mountains and it comes into Cumberland. You can see the spires of the churches and the courthouse and things. It's Cumberland, lovely old town. And this is the, I believe this is the north branch of the Potomac River, is in Cumberland, and that's where the canal ended back in the later 19th century. So again, just to give you that elevation thing, as I went from Pittsburgh to Washington, I climbed up over the Eastern Continental Divide and then dropped down to Cumberland, and from there I headed on into Washington, D.C. That section is 185 miles. The C&O Canal was constructed over 2 decades in the early to mid-19th century as a way to transport goods from the Ohio to the Potomac. So they were very keen to get over into the Ohio Valley because that led down to the Mississippi Valley, and that led into the Gulf of Mexico, and they were eager back in the late 18th century and early 19th century to create trade routes. And they did actually envision early on that they would cut this canal all the way up to Cumberland, and they would find a way then to haul the canal boats up over the mountains and then put them down on the other side of the Continental Divide, and then maybe create a canal going into Pittsburgh. But somebody else had a better idea, and before they could get that finished, they created the railroad. The B&O Railroad started in Baltimore, got to Pittsburgh before the canal even got to Cumberland. So technically it was obsolete when it was finished. Here's a section of the towpath early on out of Cumberland. It's mostly a double track, but every now and then it gets overgrown. It comes down to a very delightful to ride single path, I should say, on a kind of gravel, very wooded. And I'm heading in this photo, I'm heading east, so the canal is on my left. The towpath is always on the right, on the south side of the canal, between the canal and the river. So the river would be farther over to the right. One of the main features are the locks and viaducts, and it has a tunnel, the Pawpaw Tunnel. And this is kind of a paradigm shifting idea. They cut a tunnel through the mountain to run a canal, and it is almost as long as that Big Savage Tunnel, about 3,300 feet. It is not lit, so you need to have a flashlight or a headlamp on your bike, or a bike light to go through it. This is the western edge of the tunnel. Right now, actually, the tunnel is closed because they're doing repair work on the rocks on the east side of the tunnel. So you can't ride through it. You can get to this point on the west side and actually walk in it, but you can't walk all the way through it at the moment. I believe they're going to be working on that project for at least another year. There is a path that goes around here and up over the hill. You can walk it. It's about 1.5 miles. And as I understand, cyclists can do it. It's not the easiest thing, but you can do it. There's a picture of the tunnel from the other end. This is the eastern end, looking back into there. Is it 3 or 5 million clay-fired bricks are lining this tunnel? It took years to build. There were all sorts of labor unrest. They brought in Irish immigrants and German immigrants to build the canal. They were constantly getting into fights with the canal owners and the financiers of the canal, and so it took a lot longer than they wanted. And this section, the Pawpaw Tunnel, the idea was they were going to take out about 5 or 6 miles of canal by putting this tunnel through the mountain. But it took them so long, I've often wondered if they wouldn't have just done better to have dug the canal all the way around it. The canal also has viaducts. This is another sort of paradigm shifting thing in your mind. Again, sort of a bridge of the canal going over a creek or river, but they're beautiful, and most of them are still in existence. They don't carry water in them anymore. You just go over the old towpath, but they're lovely engineering feats. Here's one of the old locks. So there were locks every about 3 to 4 miles to lift the boats up from one section of the canal to the next. That way they kept the water level in between canals, and all the locks are still in existence. Some are in better shape than others. This one here, with its lock keeper's house, has got the big arms for opening the gates of the lock. Each of the locks had a lock keeper, and that lock keeper had a small plot of land for a garden, and their job was to be there around the clock when boats came up, drawn by mules to go into the lock. So their job was to man the lock when that happened. There are a lot of sections of canal that still have water in them, and this gives you an idea what the canal would have looked like in its heyday with its path along the side. Here's another beautiful spot just out in the middle of the woods where there's one of the locks. I believe that lock, there's only a little bit of a remnant of one of the lock keeper's houses over here on the other side. There's many nice towns along there, and a couple places I can recommend. Shepherdstown, PA. Shepherdstown is about 70 miles from Washington, so it's a little over halfway. and I stopped there for lunch. Great college town. You have to kind of get off the path, go up to a bridge and cross the bridge into Shepherdstown, but it's worth the time if you can do it. If you go on another dozen miles, you come to Harper's Ferry, which is a very historic, famous town in America. John Brown's raid there in 1859 in an attempt to create a slave uprising, probably ignited the Civil War. It's a beautiful spot, though, in many ways. When you get in town, the town's hilly. And so I had to climb up to where the place where I'd stayed, about a half a mile ride uphill. Just to give you an idea of the drama, that's Maryland Heights. So this is a picture taken from the Virginia side. So the canal is all on the Maryland side over here. So I crossed over a footbridge, which runs along next to this railroad bridge right here. And there's an old, you can see where there was a former railroad bridge here, the one of the piers still remaining. So the still active CSX railroad tracks cut across the Potomac River here, and then they cut on a tunnel through Maryland Heights. This, by the way, is a fabulous place to hike. I was first introduced to Harper's Ferry back in 1979 by some friends who took me up there for a hike. Harper's Ferry is where the Shenandoah River, which empties the Shenandoah Valley, comes into the Potomac River. Farther on down, there are places where the Potomac River basically becomes the canal. There were some spots where the rocks along the bank were so steep they couldn't cut a canal alongside it, so they just cut a path for the mules to pull the boats, and they dammed up the river, the Potomac River, and they made the river more or less the transportation spot. So this is Big Pool, which is several miles long. I did meet a lot of people riding. I did read something recently that last year there was record numbers of folks riding the route. I'm going to take a guess that that was just record numbers of people riding parts of the route, not the entire route from one end to the other. I met these two young women along the way. They're both deaf. They're from Gallaudet College in Washington, and they were among a group of people I got to know who pretty much paralleled me as I was riding the whole way. So this is at White's Ferry, which unfortunately is not running at the moment. White's Ferry is the last remaining ferry across the Potomac River, and it goes from near Williamsport, I believe. Sorry, White's Ferry on the Maryland side. I think it's Brunswick, Maryland, to Leesburg on the other side. Right now it's closed. There's been a dispute between the owners of the land. I won't go into all that. We're hoping that White's Ferry opens up again soon, because if you get over to Leesburg, you can ride the Old Dominion Railway into Alexandria. The towpath has a reputation for being muddy, and I discovered that. This actually looks pretty good here, but I went through a lot of mud puddles and got wet. I don't have a picture here of my jersey, but I got really muddy one day. I wish I had brought my fenders on my bike. Next time I ride it, I will have fenders for doing the C&O towpath. I ended my ride at milepost 0 in Georgetown. That is the Potomac River, and I think that's the Arlington Memorial Bridge in the background. If the gap starts at a dramatic spot at the point in Washington, the C&O ends at a rather non-dramatic spot, anticlimactic spot in Georgetown. In fact, it's kind of hard to find it. You have to go out of your way past the old boathouse. They do a lot of rowing here in the river, and over some bridges and kind of a roundabout to find this spot where it ends. But it's always worth searching around and getting there. But you have to do a little research to know how to get to milepost 0. Let me stop the share here and ask if there is any questions. And I'm sure there must be there's a lot of questions, looks like, in the chat. Let me look through some of the questions right here. Wow, we got a lot of information. This is great.
Russ, these are not the questions. These are the information you have been talking about.
Thank you, James. James has kept us up to date. If anybody needs to know where any of these places are, super. All the places along the river. That's right. There you go. Thanks, James. Any questions from anyone about any of the sections of the trail that I've talked about? Anybody who's ridden it wants to give a comment? Any other riders out there? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
I decided I'm doing it this summer, late summer, so that's why I'm here. I was just thinking about it and decided just yesterday, actually. So this is really convenient timing.
It's a great ride. I can't recommend it highly enough. There are many places you can stay. I did mention that, but I will talk about it now. You can do everything from camping to staying in hotels. I actually thought about camping along the way, changed my mind, decided I was working on a book that I'm writing about the route. So I decided, hey, I'm working on, and I also wrote blog posts about it, and I'll give you a link to my blog. You can read all about my route, each one of the 7 days. The link will be there in the notes that come out at the end. And I decided to stay in hotels so I could have Wi-Fi, do some writing. So I stayed in a hotel in Connellsville. There's an excellent hotel right off the trail. I mean, it's really, you can see it from the trail. It might be 100 feet from the trail in Connellsville. But all along each of these routes, there are places to stay. The Gap has more. It has bed and breakfasts and hotels and campgrounds. Ohio Pile, of course, is about halfway on the Great Allegheny Passage, and it has lots of places to stay. There's a hostel there. So there's lots of good choices for lodging and eating. The one thing I'll say about eating, the first section, the westernmost section of the C&O towpath is pretty skimpy about places to stop. Between that, my first day, I biked from Cumberland to Little Orleans, which is about 45 miles. And then I got a shuttle up to the inn where I was staying that night. There's a fabulous inn about 7 miles from Little Orleans, and they come down and shuttle you up because it's quite a climb. It's up at the top of the mountain. And if you've been riding all day, maybe you don't want to climb up. And by the way, it's not up, it's up and down, up. So anyway, there's only one place to stop between that 45-mile stretch. So you do want to make sure you're provisioned before you head out. From there on, there are more places to stay: Hancock, Maryland, and stop and eat, Hancock, Williamsport, Brunswick, lots of places. So, but it is surprising. There's more provisions and places to stop along most of the Great Allegheny Patches than there is along the Potomac River. I never would have thought the Potomac River was more remote than the Youghiogheny and Monongahela rivers. More questions? Any other riders? People want to ride? Have questions about getting out there and riding? Someone's got a picture there. Oh, you're going to do it? Shirley's going to do it. Are you going to do it on that recumbent? Is that what you're showing me there?
Something like that can hold up to the crushed limestone.
Yes, it can. Yes, it can. In fact, there are places along there where people are... where you can rent recumbent bikes.
Ooh.
That would do well.
Yeah, my son and I were traveling across the USA once, and we met a guy on a cat trike, and well, we got sold on the cat trikes.
Yeah, recumbents do really well on that road because recumbents have a harder time on just regular road riding because they're harder to see in a town or out in the countryside.
Oh, sure.
But on the Great Allegheny Passage, because you're riding the whole way without traffic. I mean, every now and then you cross through a town. Maybe there's a stop sign at most, but there's no traffic other than walkers, joggers, and cyclists.
Quick question. We're doing it here in May. I'm doing it with a bunch of a couple 13 and 12-year-old girls and moms. We're from Ohio Pal. So we have a few questions. Should we take a bob trailer? Would you recommend a one-wheel bob trailer or panniers, saddlebags?
You could do either. If there's one strong rider and you've got the trailer and they want to pull the trailer, that's a good way to do it. This is the first time I had ridden with panniers. And I've now discovered, I've gone back and done a lot of research and discovered that if you have bags, the low bags that go around the front of the bicycle, they give you better stability. The problem with the panniers is it's best if you keep them packed low. Otherwise, they tend to tip the bike. I stopped to do a lot of photography because, again, I was working on a book and I guess this presentation, and it was hard to keep the bike upright because I had a lot of weight in the panniers. Now, next time I do it, I would take less weight. And I'm also a long distance hiker walker. I walked the Camino de Santiago in 2018, 500 miles. I only had 15 pounds on my back. So there's no reason why I had to carry 35 pounds on a bike. I think I was just being lazy, not making the accurate decisions about what I need to carry or not. But you could do either. The trailer will work just fine. And if you're with a couple of girls and you don't want them to carry much equipment, maybe that's a good way to do it. So Amy, you're from Ohio Pile.
Yes.
Very good. I love Ohio Pile. Great town. Great town.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm a new rider. The most I'm able to do is 15 miles per day. I've been at it now for a little less than a year and a half, 2 years. And one of the things that's put me off to sign up for this year anyway, besides COVID, is I won't be able to make the distance on a daily basis with the rest of the riders. So should I wait obviously another year where my mileage daily is up to like 25 to 30?
So are you riding like around where you live where there's maybe hills, or is it completely flat?
I stick straight to bike trails. I live on Long Island, so the last thing I'm doing is going out the streets.
Gotcha. 30 miles a day along the Great Allegheny Passage would be just a delightful tour, because you could go like Pittsburgh to West Newton to Ohio Pile, or Connellsville. So you could do about 30 miles a day over 5 days and you would love it. So if you could work up to 30 miles a day, the interesting thing I always tell people, it's not the distance you ride, it's the time you're sitting on the bike. That is the biggest thing, because you can bike 16 miles an hour for 8 hours, or you can bike 10 miles an hour for 8 hours. No matter how you slice it, you're sitting on the bike for 8 hours. So it really doesn't come down to the distance. It's how much endurance you have to sit on your bike. And so that's what I would encourage you to work up to. So if you can get up to a speed of, say, 10 miles an hour, and you can keep that up for 3 hours, with breaks in between, you can do this.
Okay.
And you'll love it.
Russ, can you please look into the chat? There's a question.
I am looking in here. So Nancy asked, were your 2 water bottles enough for the gap? Yes, they are, because there's enough places to stop. I could have brought a third, and I might have had a third stashed away, but there's enough places to stop on the gap, especially between Pittsburgh and Connellsville. That was always a more populated area. There are also pumps along the way. The C&O has pumps every few miles because they have campgrounds every 5 to 10 miles. The C&O towpath is a national park. It's quite different. It's a national, a national park. So there's camping, and that camping along there is remote. In other words, you have to be on the bike to get to it. There aren't roads leading into most of the campgrounds. Someone asked the water in the C&O. I didn't drink any of the water in the C&O. I always filled up my water bottles in towns wherever I was stopping. So I didn't get to sample it. Sorry. I wish I could answer.
Russ, this is Todd. I asked that question, and I have a tough time drinking it because of the iodine, and I would just give a warning to maybe pack your own water in. I suppose some people can drink it, but I really didn't enjoy it.
So you're talking about the water that comes out of the pumps.
Okay. The pumps, it's treated with the iodine, and it's not pleasant. It's got almost a chemical taste to it, at least for my taste.
I understand. Nancy asked about rain gear. I have a cycling rain jacket that I bring along with me. It's a jacket so the hood even comes up over my helmet. It's a special cycling jacket. It has zip pits, so you can get vented. I used that on the day that I rode in a light rain and a lot of mud. Nancy says she's ridden the Gap twice. Your favorite rail trail? I can believe it. You and me both. Let's see. Let's more questions. Did I use a helmet with a mirror attached? Yes, I do. I've been riding with a mirror on the left side of my helmet for over 20 years. In 1999, I got hit by a car in a bike lane, and I decided that I needed to up my game, and I got that mirror, and I am so used to using it. When I hear the cars coming, I start looking behind me for the cars. I look out for, doesn't matter when you're on the trail. I guess on the trail, I was looking for cyclists that might have been trying to pass me, but that weren't too many of them. Most cyclists don't ride too fast on those trails. But when I'm riding on the road, yes, I have a mirror, and I'm always looking out for traffic. I'm keeping an eye on how close to me they are. Yeah, you probably don't need it on the rails trails, but boy, a mirror around town everywhere. I'm a habitual user. I've had accidents. I've only been hit by a car once, and I have not been hit by a car now in 22 years. Let's hope that stays true. Haven't had an accident in 12 years. Let's hope that stays also that way. The cars can kill you. That's why I love rails to trails, but I do ride 2,000 to 3,000 miles a year on the roads around here. Question, are electric assist bikes welcome? Yes, you can use an e-bike. You cannot use an e-bike is not considered a motorized vehicle like a moped or a four-wheeler. Yeah, every now and then you'll encounter a four-wheeler on the trail. That is illegal. I don't like that. Getting close to Pittsburgh, there are some old slag heaps and what they call gob piles where they used to dump all the waste from the mines. And those are overgrown, but four-wheelers like to use those, and sometimes they access those gob piles on the trail. Don't like that. They're not supposed to do that. Amy asked about a recumbent over the Paw Paw detour. You will have to push it up the trail. That is a good question. I think you can make it. There is a group on Facebook called Gap and C&O Trail Enthusiasts. It's a pretty big group. That's how I actually announced this class on that group. And that's an often asked question. So if you were to go to that Facebook group and search for it, because a lot of people ask, can you get up over there with a trailer? I think a recumbent bike would make it. Andy says you have a road bike with thin tires. Will that work on the trail? You can do that on the Gap. I would not attempt the C&O towpath with anything less than a 35 millimeter tire. It is rough in places. There are tree roots, there's mud, and there's actually some deep mud in places. And that gets hard with thin tires. And some of the sections are quite stony. Now, this is interesting. They are paving sections of the C&O with the crushed limestone. And when I was on it last September, it was paved all the way from Shepherdstown, which is about mile 74, to White's Ferry, which is mile 30. And I now understand that they've paved it farther on from White's Ferry. And I think the goal is eventually to get into Washington, D.C. The roughest parts of the route for me were way far in the west between Cumberland and the Paw Paw Tunnel, where there were a lot of larger rocks and roots. The next worst part was the last 10 miles into Washington, where it's just very rocky. The trail is very rocky, and in my opinion, not that well maintained, but people say it's supposed to be an authentic towpath for the trail, so that's what it is. That's why I recommend bigger tires. You'll feel it if you're on a narrow tire. Any more questions? Go ahead and feel free to unmute yourself and just shout out a question. You can just ask your question.
How are the trails maintained?
How are the trails maintained? Good question. And I should put a picture in here because I met a trail volunteer along the way. And this is the interesting thing. When they created the Great Allegheny Passage, so there's two different methods. The C&O towpath is a national park. So that's maintained by the Park Service. And by the way, I didn't mention this, could put a photo in there, but they're often enough, and I encountered a lot of these downed trees or tree limbs on the C&O towpath. In fact, I went through there a day after a storm, and there was a tree that had come down that was big enough you couldn't get around it. And we had to backtrack and take a little detour past it. The Great Allegheny Passage was originally a network of local trails, and there were local trail groups that envisioned opening up that old railroad bed and creating a rideable surface. And so this is the interesting thing. The Great Allegheny Passage was originally a patchwork of sections that were completed. So there'd be a section of it complete, and then you might have 10 miles where it was incomplete, and then another 5 miles complete. And eventually they got all of those local groups to combine, and they combined their efforts, and that is now the Great Allegheny Passage, the whole route. But those local groups still remain in existence, and they work on that trail, and they do a great job. I've seen some pictures of some of them out recently grooming the limestone. So they go along there and they re-smooth it, and they're volunteers, and we can't thank them enough. Those of us that ride it, those local trail groups. And I met one of those volunteers while I was riding and chatted with him for a while. He was just picking up trash. It was in Boston. There's a nice little information a place in Boston. I've got my map here from the route. Boston is about, it looks like it's about 25 miles from Pittsburgh. It's one of the early coal mining towns you come to. Someone else had another question.
I was just going to make a comment as a Washington local that I find the approach into Washington on weekends has gotten extremely busy. I don't bike there anymore because there are pedestrians and kids, and so I'm actually, when I plan my trip, I'm gonna plan on getting in on a weekday because it's just crazy on weekends there.
I can understand it. And Sergey, when I actually got close to the very end, maybe the last 2 or 3 miles, I actually got off the C&O towpath and got on the Capitol Crescent Trail, which parallels it, and took the Capitol Crescent because the C&O was harder to navigate. It was rougher, but also there were a lot of joggers on it. And the Capitol Crescent Trail didn't have joggers. They had mostly cyclists. Someone asked, do you need reservations for Swains Lock Campground? I don't know the answer to that one. The campgrounds all along the more remote sections of the C&O you just stop at. So I'm not sure about Swains Lock if that's different. Ann says downland trees are wide, recommend panniers instead of a trailer. That is a good point. I will say the down trees don't stay down forever. Usually within a few hours, somebody comes out and cleans them up once the Park Service is notified that they're down. I have seen a down tree on the Great Allegheny Passage. That also happens less often, but I've seen them on there when I've been on it before years ago. We got a couple more minutes. Any more questions?
I have another one.
Yes.
How about biking in the fall, like late September, October versus, May or April or whatever on the towpath and the passage rather?
I'll tell you my tip. My favorite time of year to ride the Great Allegheny Passage is any time from late August to late September. It is beautiful.
Thank you.
It tends to be drier. The colors come out, especially in late September. Western Pennsylvania is blanketed with fall wildflowers, asters and such, and they are, unless you don't like goldenrod, which you might not like it, it is stunning. It is beautiful. I've ridden it. That's my favorite time of year. I will say the next best time of year is mid to late May, because when you go through Ohiopyle State Park, you will see the trillium, the wild trillium, which is one of the most beautiful wildflowers there is. It is in abundance in Ohiopyle State Park. So that would be my next choice. But you just can't beat late August through late September. The temperatures are a bit cooler. When you get through the Allegheny Highlands, the temperatures drop at night, and it's a bit drier, so it's not unpleasant. I lived there for decades, and I never had air conditioning. So if you're thinking about that time of year, Patrick, that's when I'd go for it. Yeah. Ann says late October, DC to Pittsburgh trips, the days are shorter. That's a good point. Yes. You better get in early. I rode an average of about 50 miles a day, though the first 2 days I rode 60 miles a day. You can do it at 60 to 70 miles a day, but if you just take a 30 miles a day and enjoy stopping, if you're going slower, you can stop and read the historical markers, and they are worth it. There's also natural history markers going through Ohiopyle. And that Youghiogheny Gorge to Ohio Pal State Park, which I think is a total of about 25 miles, is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. And that's one of the secrets of the Great Allegheny Passage. Even going on past it, up the Castleman River is also beautiful. Well, thanks everybody for coming to this class. You were a great group. If anybody's new to get set up, I'm glad to have you here. These classes are free, so go check out the Get Set Up schedule. There's lots of good stuff you can do, and I'll be doing this class actually again in a little over a week. I'll be doing it on a Thursday afternoon, and then we'll probably let it sit for a while and bring it back sometime in the summer. I love to talk about it. As I said, I'm writing a book about this. I wrote a book about my experience walking the Camino de Santiago. My next book is going to be about riding the Great Allegheny Passage. I love not only the beauty of it, but the history of it. I know a lot about the history of the coal and coke mining in Pittsburgh. If I weren't in Western Pennsylvania, I've often said Pittsburgh is where I live. So thanks everybody for being with us tonight, and glad to have you, and I hope to see you in another class. Have a good evening, everyone.
You like that? Very good.
Oh, someone asked about a packing list. Yes, I'll get you the packing list in your notes.